All right, so again, we were talking mid stance. So sagittal plane motion is going to be taken care of by momentum. We talked about that, we showed you that. Frontal plane motion is going to need to be handled by muscles. So one momentum, one muscles. So we talked about it. So if I'm doing this, my right leg is in open chain abduction. If I am doing this, my right leg is in closed chain abduction. If I'm doing this, my left leg is in open chain adduction. If I am doing this, my left leg is in closed chain adduction. Good. You can see that. This is going to help you a lot. Okay, so in mid stance, it is essential that I have muscles help to maintain the height of my pelvis. So I need muscles to help maintain the height of my pelvis. So when I go into mid stance, one leg is on the ground, the other one is completely off. So this leg is moving in the swing. My left leg is in swing. My right leg is going to be in stance. Remember, we said there's a couple of things that can affect the swing of my left leg. One could be flexion of my stance leg knee. If it's dropped, it's going to kick. The other one could be the dropping of my pelvis on my left side. So if my left pelvis drops, that's going to affect my knee from moving forward. Right? We're good there. Okay. So in mid stance, the natural nature of my hip wants to move me into closed chain adduction. Like, because my adductor magnus is contracting along with my hamstrings to help keep me out of recurvatum. So adductor magnus is contracting because of where its position is on the issue of tuberosity, whole lot of stuff. But just adductor magnus is also contracting, and its job is it wants to drag me into closed chain adduction. Make sense? So I need some muscles to function against that to help keep me in closed chain neutral. So I need to actively have my abductor muscles contracting to compensate for the activity of adductor magnus. So when I'm in mid stance, I need hip abductor muscles contracting to compensate for the activity of adductor magnus. So I need abductors working to compensate for the activities of my large adductor. Okay, so when I'm in mid stance, glute med, glute max primarily are contracting to help hold me in neutral pelvis. So my pelvis remains neutral. So if my index finger is going on each side of my pelvis and I'm holding my pelvis, my thumbs are on PSIS, it keeps me level. Glute med is contracting to keep that position. If glute med and glute minimus are not strong enough to help do that, then what's going to happen is the action of adductor magnus is going to kick in at its full capacity, and it's going to pull me into stance leg closed chain adduction. So my stance hip is going to move up like that. So it's closed chain adduction on my stance leg. So it's going to move my hip up. My hip on the stance side moves up. But the compensatory action is my swing hip drops down. Does that make sense? So I'm in closed chain adduction. My stance leg is going to elevate slightly, but my swing leg is going to drop significantly. And that's going to prevent me from getting a full swing phase. That is what we call Trendelenburg. That's what's happening. Closed chain adduction on the stance side leads to swing side pelvis dropping. So my opposite pelvis is going to drop because my stance side is moving into closed chain adduction. Does that make sense? All right. And you can see this when you have them do single leg stands. If you're checking a patient, have them stand on their sound side, put your hand on their iliac crest, hand on their pelvis, have them stand on their sound side. When they lift one leg, it's going to stay the same. When they stand on the opposite leg, number one, they're not going to be able to do it for long because going into closed chain adduction hurts. Nobody likes it, especially when you're being forced to do it. Like it aches. It aches on the greater troch. That's why they hurt so bad on greater trochanter, because those muscles are being overly stretched. But when you do it on their non-sound side, when they go to stand, their pelvis is going to do that. It's going to drop every time. So you'll see it in single leg stands. So a great thing to do. Check a patient's single leg stand if you think they have Trendelenburg. Yes, ma'am?
How do you name this?
Mm-hmm.
How do you name it, like, on what side? Because when I was at clinicals, it was asking me, what, they didn't know how to name it, and I was like, well, I don't remember. Like,
Well, I mean, you're having closed chain adduction on the stance side, but nobody names it that way.
No,
So you
the
name it for,
Trendelenburg.
you name it for the side that's
It
dropped.
drops, so
Yeah.
the right side drops, the right side.
Right. So if I'm standing, if I'm gating, if I'm walking, so let's say single leg stance. If I am standing and I stand on my right leg and my left pelvis drops, it's really a right Trendelenburg. So the weakness is on my right glute medius. Does that make sense? So it's what's causing my left to drop. So I'm going to name it right hip. It's a left Trendelenburg gait pattern because of right hip weakness.
So the pelvis that's dropping is what you would name it.
Right.
So left.
So it's a left Trendelenburg. It's right glute med weakness producing a left leg Trendelenburg gait.
And that's how you would write it.
That's the way I would write, yes. Because you need to address, because if I just write left leg Trendelenburg, somebody's going to go, what? But I need to let them know the Trendelenburg is on the left, the pelvis is dropped on the left, but it's because the muscles on the right are weak. I need to address my right side glute med, glute minimus muscles. I gotta fix that. So I'm going to tell them where the problem is occurring and what it's producing in my notes. So in mid stance, momentum does sagittal plane, flexion extension. Frontal plane has to be managed by muscles. Glute med, glute max, and some TFL as you're getting into the end parts of mid stance. Because now the hip is in flexion and abduction. So I go from here, mid stance, to now moving into some hip flexion at the end, getting ready to go into heel off. So now some TFL is clicking in. But mostly glute med and glute minimus are stabilizers of our hip. Make sense? Good stuff. Good stuff. I'll take it. Okay. Alrighty. So now let's talk about terminal stance or heel off. So what's happening there? Okay. So terminal stance, I am going to be moving from dorsiflexion, the 5 degrees of dorsiflexion, now I'm going to be moving into about, I'm going to be moving into plantar flexion now. So as we go into heel off, it says the ankle is going to move from full dorsiflexion into plantar flexion. So let's talk about how we get there. So it talks about it's at 15 degrees of dorsiflexion and then gets to a rapid 5 degree of plantar flexion. How do we get there? Glad you asked. So as I'm going into terminal stance, so I was just in mid swing, I was in about 5 degrees of dorsiflexion, mid swing, we're okay there. So now as I am getting ready to, I'm stretching out with my swing leg and getting ready to initially contact with it. So now this ankle is going to have to move farther forward to allow for that to happen. So now I'm in about 15 degrees of plantar flexion there. And my whole foot is still in contact with the ground. So I'm still in closed chain, but now I'm reaching out with this leg so that I can make initial contact with my swing leg. So I go from 5 degrees to 15 degrees of of dorsiflexion really rapid. So 5 degrees to 15 degrees, and that's because I'm getting ready to make initial contact. Once I make initial contact with my opposite leg or my swing leg, then my heel comes off the ground. And that's where things get cool. Because now, just like with initial contact or heel strike, because something is now touching the ground, it now affects how I look at the joint, closed chain or open chain. Because something is now off the ground, is going to affect how I look at dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. So my tibia is in this position. It's anterior over my talus, so this looks like dorsiflexion. But the moment my heel comes up, I am now in rear foot. No. So what is my rear foot doing now?
Your rear foot is open to you.
Yes. Right. When I do this, when that heel comes up, now that shifts my thinking immediately. Now my rear foot now is in open chain. So you can try that. That's the way you dance. When you dance and you pivot. So you try to pivot with both feet on the ground, it doesn't do anything. If I come up on my toes, I can pivot. My rear foot is an open chain, so it allows for my forefoot to allow me to pivot. Right? Make sense? Good stuff. So now, when my heel comes up, now I get to look at this totally different. See, now at first I was looking at this as a closed chain object, meaning the position of my tibia in relationship to my talus in my heel or in my foot. Now, when my heel comes up, my tibia is still in the same position, but now I have to measure this as plantar flexion because my heel is open chain. Does that make sense? So that's how I get to 5 degrees of plantar flexion. So I go from 15 degrees of dorsiflexion. The only thing that changes, I'm still in this angle, but once I raise that heel, now I'm in open chain rear foot. It's like if I wanted to pivot, I open chain the rear foot and I swing. So now I'm in rear foot open chain. So now this is observed as if I were in plantar flexion. So that's how I get into that 5 degrees of plantar flexion. Make sense? So the rear foot becomes open chain when my heel comes off the ground. That's why it's also referred to as heel off. Okay. So now it's important, as I'm moving into this, the initial part of the movement is going to be done still by momentum. So momentum is doing the initial part of this. So it's getting me from my 5 degrees of dorsiflexion through my 15 degrees of dorsiflexion, even to my heel off a little bit. So because momentum is doing this, initially the same thing is happening as it was in mid stance. My plantar flexors, my gastrocsoleus, are going to be contracting eccentrically to slow everything down, to make sure that I get my full step length on my swing leg. So they're still going to be eccentrically contracting. Once I get to touch my foot down with my swing leg, now it's going to shift rapidly. It's going to go from just eccentrically slowing things down to them going into a concentric push off. Because that's how I get my full step length out. So it's going to help me create push off. So a little bit before I get my foot totally on the ground for initial contact, it's going to shift from slowing everything down to now becoming concentric and helping me to push off to create that last bit of step length. So the push off function of gait happens there at heel off. So my plantar flexors, dorsiflexors go from slowing everything down to by the time my heel actually comes off the ground, now they're going to start to concentrically contract to get push off. Okay? So they're eccentric to concentric. Okay? So they're going to be eccentric to concentric because they're going to have to create push off, creating that step length. Okay? In terminal stance or heel off, my knee is still in 0 degrees, still held there. The knee is still weighted because I'm still in closed chain because of my forefoot. So my knee is still extended, still being held there by screw home, still being controlled by the plantar flexors, slowing everything down. My hip moves now into 20 degrees of extension. So let's talk about that. So how does my hip move into 20 degrees of extension? I'm still in closed chain. So remember, initial contact, 25 degrees of hip flexion. Pelvis, greater troch, lateral epicondyle, 25 degrees. 15 degree on foot flat. Mid stance, neutral. Trunk is in line. Now, trunk is in front because now I'm getting ready to do my heel off. So my trunk now moves in front of my hip. So now when the trunk is in front of my hip, this angle is an extension angle. So when my trunk is now in front, my pelvis is in front of my lateral epicondyle of my femur. Now I'm in hip extension. Does that make sense? So the only thing that's changed is the position of my pelvis and my trunk over my closed chain hip. So my hip is in closed chain, and as I'm moving into different positions, it then varies the joint angle. Okay? So now it's moving into about 20 degrees of hip extension.
And that would still just be from momentum, right?
Still momentum. Yep. Still momentum is doing the work. Mid stance, terminal stance. Yeah. So still momentum is doing the work. Okay. Now I move into pre-swing. So I'm going into pre-swing or toe off. Now I'm moving into even more plantar flexion, because now in pre-swing, my toes are still loaded on the ground, but my heel is still significantly off the ground. So now I'm found in this position where I was in this position with heel off, toe off, I'm now here. So the ball of my foot is still in contact with the ground, but my heel and now my midfoot are totally off the ground. So I'm getting ready to lift my toes off to go into swing phase.
But heel off is responsible for the push off.
Mm-hmm. Heel off is where I get push off. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here I'm moving into even more plantar flexion, because now not just my heel is off, but my midfoot is off the ground. So my heel and my midfoot are off the ground. Okay. My metatarsophalangeal joint, so tarsals, metatarsal, phalanx, my metatarsophalangeal joints are going to now move into extension, because now I'm literally on the ball of my foot. The heel and the midfoot are off, so they're moving into extension about 60 degrees. The great toe is going to go all the way up to about 90 degrees of extension. So first MTP gets to about 90, second through fifth gets to about 60 degrees for a toe off. So I'm moving into extension. I'm moving into more MTP extension and plantar flexion. Okay, so my calf muscles created my swing, so now they're turning off. So they don't need to do nearly as much. The only thing that's contracting here is my flexor hallucis longus to get ready to flex it's getting ready to flex my ankle. It's going to get ready to it's getting ready to plantar flex the ankle to help with swing phase. Okay. My knee is going from 0 degrees, so where it was in 0 degrees in heel off, now it's getting ready to flex. It's going to get to about 40 degrees of flexion as I'm in toe off, because it's getting ready to go into swing phase. So swing phase is getting ready to occur. So my knee has to flex to get ready to swing. A straight knee doesn't allow for that. It's going to create some type of antalgic gait. Okay. A lot of the flexion happens not because the hamstrings are contracting. It deals with the weight shifting to your stance leg. The opposite leg is now in foot flat, and I'm shifting my weight to my stance leg, so that flexes my knee. That's that momentum does the work type of deal. Remember when we talked about momentum does a lot of the work? That's what's happening. Okay. So that's what's happening there at my ankle and at my knee. At my hip, it's moving from 20 degrees of extension into neutral. little bit of backwards rotation. So as I'm going into toe off, now I'm getting ready to, now I'm bringing my hip back into a neutral position so that this leg can go into swing, which is going to ultimately put it back into extension. So it's either moving from flexion to extension. Okay? Still, momentum is doing the work here, even in terminal stance. Okay? And so, as we are getting toward the end there, then we're going to have, as the knee is flexing, so my toe is coming off, iliopsoas, rectus are now getting ready to turn on because they're going to help with knee flexion or hip flexion, excuse me, during initial swing or acceleration. So they're getting ready to come on to help lift the hip during acceleration or initial swing. Okay. And so that's all of stance phase gait. That's your stance phase. Any questions? Okay. All right. Swing phase is even more fluid, so it's not nearly as crazy as stance. You have 5 phases of stance, 3 phases of swing. So let's go to swing, the acceleration phase. Now I moved from toe off to now my foot is actually going into swing, or my hip, knee, and foot are in swing phase. Okay, so I went from when I was in my terminal stance, or pre-swing, or excuse me. So when I was in toe off or pre-swing phase, my ankle was in about 20 degrees of plantar flexion. So we talked about that. So in that stage, I'm in about 20 degrees of plantar flexion. So the only thing that's on the ground is the ball of my foot. My midfoot and my heel are off the ground. Once I go into acceleration or initial swing, I go from this 20 degrees of plantar flexion to about 10 degrees of plantar flexion. Now I'm lifting my foot off the ground. So now I'm coming out of this plantar flexion created because the heel and the midfoot are off the ground. Now I'm lifting my foot off the ground, and now I am in still about 20 degrees, I'm in about 10 degrees of plantar flexion. So ultimately, throughout the swing phase, I'm going to move from plantar flexion into dorsiflexion so that my foot will clear. So that's the first phase of me moving into dorsiflexion. So I'm going to move it to about 10 degrees. Tib anterior long toe extensors are contracting concentrically to produce this motion. So I don't need them to lengthen. I don't need them to push me into plantar flexion. I need them to shorten so that they can lift my foot, because I need to clear my foot for swing. My knee is going to go into about 60 degrees of flexion as it's bending up behind me. So biceps femoris short head is going to be one of the main muscles helping to perform this. So not all of my hip extensors and my knee flexors are working, just short head of biceps femoris. And then my hip is going to be in about 15 degrees of flexion. So it's moving into flexion. So now I'm bringing my leg through, getting ready to go into my full swing. So my hip is coming in front of my opposite leg. So now it's in about 15 degrees of flexion. Okay? And that's going to be controlled by some really weird muscles. Adductor iliacus and psoas is going to be helping with that. Adductor longus sartorius. It's kind of weird. But it's moving into hip flexion. So I'm here. Okay? Now, mid-swing, where my foot actually clears the ground, I'm going to move from any plantar flexion back into neutral. So now my foot is going to, instead of it being in plantar flexion or coming off in plantar flexion, here is going to come to neutral so that it can swing through. This is where I get foot clearance in mid-swing. So I need my foot to be in 0 degrees or neutral dorsiflexion. So it needs to come out of plantar flexion into neutral dorsiflexion, at least. Okay? So my dorsiflexions here will still be concentric. They're helping to flex my knee in mid-swing. If I don't get this dorsiflexion from my tib anterior and my pretibial muscles, then I won't have adequate foot clearance. And remember, foot clearance is only about 1 centimeter. It's not a whole lot. We're not clearing the ground by 2 feet, unless you're stepping really weirdly, like you're a prancing horse. We'll talk about that later. So, okay, so 1 centimeter. My knee is going to flex all the way to 65 degrees, and then it's going to rapidly begin to extend to about 25 degrees of flexion. So as I'm going into mid-swing, it's about 65 here, foot clearance, and then it's going to start to extend to about 25 because now I'm getting ready to go into terminal swing or deceleration, and I'm going to need to slow the leg down because I'm getting ready to put it on the ground. It's just like a plane. You're getting ready to land the plane, you're putting the brakes on, you're letting out the landing gear, you're hitting you're putting it, you're slowing it down. That's what's going on with the knee in mid-swing. Short head of biceps femoris still contracting, helping to do a lot of that. So it does a lot in as it relates to the swinging of the knee. A lot of it is done by momentum, so it's kind of helping to pull it up. So it doesn't need a lot of muscle action there. Then the hip is going into about 25 degrees of flexion, the same position we're going to find it in initial contact. So it's going to be in about that 25 degrees of flexion starting in mid-swing because this is how it's going to help put itself down. So, same thing. And momentum is doing the work there. So hamstrings come in late phase to kind of help slow everything down. And then finally, we have our terminal swing or deceleration. This is where we're getting ready to put the heel down on initial contact. So we're really slowing everything down. So we're still in neutral dorsiflexion. So the heel is not on the ground yet. So it's still neutral dorsiflexion. When you're looking at the angle here, it's about a neutral dorsiflexion. I know it looks like it's in full dorsiflexion, but it's still about neutral. As it's coming through for terminal stance or deceleration. The knee is moving towards 0, the same position it's going to be in on initial contact. So we're getting quadriceps to help pull us into extension there concentrically. And then the hamstrings are also working to decelerate the leg. So they're slowing down some of that momentum. If the hamstrings aren't working there to decelerate the leg, we get this weird kick out thing where the knee kind of hyperextends. It looks really weird. You'll see people walk like that because they don't have the hamstring to slow it down. Okay. And then the hip, again, still in that 25 degrees of flexion, same position on initial contact. We're getting some deceleration work there, so it's slowing everything down. So everything is being slowed down. Hamstrings are still working at the hip, decelerating it, slowing it down. So they're eccentrically working to slow it down. Glute max kicks in, so it's getting ready to do weight acceptance for initial contact. So remember that's important. Glute max for initial contact. Okay. And that's gait. Phasically, every phase, what's going on with gait? Okay. Any questions there?
This might be off topic, but how does gait change when you're wearing a prosthesis?
It depends on where it articulates. So depending on,
Is it transtibial or transfemoral?
so if it's transtibial, then you still have the functions of the knee will still be the same. You'll lose just the functions of the ankle. So the function of the knee, function of the hip will still be the same. As long as the prosthesis is adjusted properly, you'll still be able to function with those doing the same thing. When you have a transfemoral prosthesis, you'll lose those different joints. And so the articulation, like you'll have a C leg, and it will still flow and function like a regular knee and ankle. Like it has a brain, it has computer chips built inside of it to function like a regular knee and ankle. And it will still flow like that. And depending on what type of prosthesis, if you have a tibial, they'll give you one with a articulated ankle joint, and it will know how to maintain dorsiflexion when you're going into swing phase, as long as they're adjusted properly. So when they don't adjust properly, or it's too long, or it's too awkward, or it's sitting on the different sides of the cup, that's when you're going to get deficits with your walking.
So it should be normal unless there's something wrong with it.
Right. Should be limited obvious deficits with the prosthesis. So if it's fitted correctly by a great prosthetist and great therapy working on those components that are left, there should be, if you aren't in shorts, there should be no obvious deficits. Like I shouldn't be able to obviously pick you out and go, whoo, you have a prosthesis. So
what about those ones that are like just the running ones?
Those are, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean that's totally different. Yeah. So that's.
Is that not a prosthesis?
No, it is,
Yeah.
but it's fitted totally different. So it's coil based. It's like springs built inside of it, and so it gives you back energy as you hit the ground. That's why they were having the questions about could they be used in the Olympics, or are they an unfair advantage? I forgot the guy's name. I think he was indicted for doing something in Africa. But he was the guy that petitioned to run in those in the Olympics, and they kept saying it gives him an unfair advantage because they're coiled and they're springs. So they're different than general prosthesis. Like you wouldn't use that to walk around on. It's very uncomfortable.
I saw someone walk around with one, so that's why I asked.
No, it shouldn't.
Very strange.
Yeah, no, that it's not meant for just general walking around. It should be meant for sports and activities. Yeah, so usually people who have those will have multiple. Like they'll have one that they'll use every day, and then they'll switch to that one for sport, for things like running and things like bounding, leaping, jumping, things like that. Good question. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now we'll head to the deficits. So we'll do some deficits today and get through some of those. So we'll go to about 11:45, and then we'll take a lunch break. And then we'll come back about 1:15. Okay, so let's get through the first one. Let's talk about if I don't have adequate glute max muscle contraction. So where is glute max really in its most functional state? When do I need it the most?
Weight acceptance for initial contact.
Weight acceptance for initial contact. Yes, ma'am, 100%. I need glute max the most for weight acceptance for initial contact. Heel strike. I need to be able to have my hip extensor, my glute max contracting, pulling me into extension so that I can accept the weight that's getting ready to be placed on my leg and stands on it so that I can progress the other leg forward. If I lack glute max activity, glute max is not functional, then what I'm going to do is compensate through overuse of my trunk extenders or my erector spinae muscles. So I'm going to compensate through the use of erector spinae muscles. And that's going to give me what's called the gluteus maximus lurch, or I call it the old Snoop Dogg walk. So when I get ready to weight accept, instead of keeping my trunk in neutral like it should be, I'm going to throw my trunk into hyperextension to create weight acceptance. So it's So that's the way I would walk, because glute max is not functioning in its capacity for weight acceptance during initial contact or heel strike. So I'm going to use my trunk extenders, erector spinae, to compensate, and that forces me to throw myself back when I initially contact the ground.
That deviation will be on your right side, you know.
Whichever leg is going into initial contact with weak glutes. So if I'm walking, if it was my right side, every time I initially contacted the ground and tried to weight accept, I was going to hyperextend to do it. So if it was my right side, it would. So I'm going to throw myself into trunk extension to help compensate for weak glute max, hip extensors. Make sense? It's called Gluteus Maximus lurch. I'll try to pull some videos so you can see these. Okay. The next one that we'll talk about is what happens if I have a weak gluteus medius. When do I need glute med the most? Mid stance. Remember, we said sagittal plane is handled by momentum. Frontal plane in mid stance is managed by muscles. There you go. One is managed by momentum, the other is managed by muscles. So sagittal plane is managed by momentum. It's going to happen because momentum. Frontal plane, ab and adduction, is going to be managed by muscles. So when I'm in mid stance, I need glute med and glute min to help hold my hip in its static position so that the activity of my adductor magnus doesn't pull me into closed chain adduction. I don't need it to do that. Because its adductor magnus is going to turn on, it's going to fire. And if it fires, it's going to pull me into closed chain adduction. So I need glute med and glute min to contract to offset the activity of adductor magnus to help hold me in neutral. When it does not, when it's weak or it's paralyzed because superior gluteal nerve is not functioning, then now every time I try to go into a single leg stance, it's going to pull me into closed chain adduction on that side and make my pelvis drop on the side where I am non-weight bearing. Does that make sense? So it's going to pull me into closed chain adduction on the stance side, and the non-weight bearing side, I'm going to have hip drop. That's what we call Trendelenburg. So when the person walks, when they go and try to go into mid stance, it's going to drop. And it drops on the side opposite the dysfunction. So if my left hip is dropping when I'm taking a step, hang on, let's see here. My left hip is dropping, it's because the dysfunction is on which side?
Right side.
Very good. Gosh, that hurt. I don't see how people do that all day. Very good. Trendelenburg. So, to compensate for that, because I know it's going to happen, one of the things I can do to compensate is lateral trunk lean to the side where the Trendelenburg is occurring. So I will lateral trunk lean to my right to clear my leg. Make sense? So I'm throwing my trunk to my right, trying to clear my leg to the left so that I can get a partial swing phase on it.
So you
Which
lean,
leg? I'm sorry.
so you lean to the side where the muscle is weak.
Yes, absolutely. I'm leaning to the weak side because I'm compensating to that side. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So if you're have an injury, if you have total knee on your right side,
Mhm.
and so you're more likely to lean away from that side.
Well, the knee shouldn't affect, like if you have total knee, superior gluteal nerve shouldn't be affected. So if they're walking that way with total knee, I'm worried about the patient. Like that's one of those I'm going to stop them and go, why are you limping with your hip? Your hip is fine. You shouldn't have, did you have, I would start out by asking them other questions first. Like, hey, that's an interesting way you're walking there. Did you have hip problems before you had knee problems? Or has your hip given you problems before? Because I'm going to start to ask them about the hip, because there's nothing, a knee replacement should not affect glute med or the nerve that affects glute med. So,
What if they're just not putting weight on it because it hurts? So they're leaning into
So-
Trendelenburg because of the pain.
It wouldn't be Trendelenburg then, it'd be antalgic gait. Because it's almost like a limping. They're just trying not to put weight on it. So Trendelenburg is true glute med weakness that causes my pelvis to drop because glute med.
Document that as lateral or like
No.
pelvic tilt towards.
No, if the example you gave about the knee replacement, I would just call it antalgic gait pattern on their right leg secondary to total knee replacement. So you would just document, because they're not wanting to put weight on their leg because it hurts. No different if I walked up to you and took a hammer and banged your knee as hard as I could and told you to stand up and walk. You'd stand up and you'd walk funny. You'd have an antalgic gait. It's not that you have glute med weakness. You're just hurting because your knee hurts. So I'm just going to document the dysfunction at the knee because your knee aches and you're trying to avoid putting weight on it. So it should, antalgic gait in true Trendelenburg, like I'm going to pull your video to see true Trendelenburg. When you see it, you go, oh crap, yeah, I 100% get this now. So yeah, it is totally different than antalgic gait. Good questions, both good questions. So they will either walk like the Trendelenburg and they're going to stay having greater trochanteric pain. It's going to always be hip pain. Until they get glute med firing again, it's going to always hurt. There's nothing that's going to make that feel better. They have to get glute med fired. So unless they have a truly damaged gluteal nerve, you got to get that muscle firing. So if we're working with the patient, what do we want to start out with? If they have weak glute med but no nerve damage. Okay, I agree. Give me examples. What am I doing? What is your initial thought pattern? This is your patient. This is I'm sending my 75-year-old grandmother to you. With right hip pain and weakness. And notable Trendelenburg. All right. Okay. So this is my 75-year-old grandmother. We work together. Done the eval. This is what I'm finding. What are we doing? Agreed. That's easy. How? How is what are we doing?
Well, it's
Decrease pain.
painful.
Okay.
But, so you would try to decrease the pain, of course. But
Okay.
to try to do the weakness, could you do like clamshells with a band within
All
the
right.
range of within the range
So-
of pain?
Talk through what you're talking about. You're giving me specifics, but I want to know. I want you to think generality. So let me give it to you like this. So I did my manual muscle test. She is a 2 minus out of 5. Pain. She is a 6 out of 10. Up to about an 8 out of 10 with gait. Single leg stance time less than 5 seconds. Prolonged gait. Less than 2 minutes before she has to stop. What are we doing?
I would start progressing like supine to sideline with just abduction
Okay.
and
So side lying abduction.
Well, claim supine.
Or-
Two is two minus.
Ab,
So
I would show her
Could you
how
do
her
ab-
gait's wrong and then fix her gait.
could
How?
you do
So-
abduction with like
so-
a gait belt doing isometrics? Since it's so
abduction
painful?
with the gait belt doing isometrics.
'Cause
Y'all are way too advanced. It's a 75-year-old lady. She's 2 minus. What
Okay.
position are we gonna start her in? Let's start with it.
Sit.
Yeah.
Supine or
Supine.
sitting?
Specific. Give me one. Supine. Thank you.
That's what I was.
Why?
That's what I was saying. Start with supine and then progress to supine.
Okay. Why are we starting in supine?
Because you have
It's
two
not
minus and
against
that's
gravity.
gravity.
Thank you. So if I have a 2 minus little old lady who is hurting, the thing I want to do is put her in supine, and that's the word I was looking for. Gravity eliminated. Absolutely. So I'm not starting her on the side, working on clamshells. It's gonna hurt. She's already hurting. Supine. Let's start firing the muscles. So what am I gonna do supine? Day one. This is day one. What do I wanna do?
Abduction with TheraBand.
I wouldn't do theirs.
You could put a towel
I put
under
a towel on her
heel.
foot.
There we go. Okay. Now that's an exercise I would start with the 75-year-old lady. So towel underfoot. Abduction. What do I want to make sure when she's doing that? Because she's going to cheat.
That she's not.
What am I going to tell her?
To keep her
She's
foot.
not externally rotating. Just.
You're close.
To keep her foot facing, like pointing towards the ceiling, so if she turns it, it would be hip flexors too.
I kind of, yeah, but even something even more that's going to help me even more. What position do I want her foot in? No. What position?
Oh, to help. Well, that is.
You probably were thinking the right thing.
In.
Yes.
Rotation.
Yes. Yes. Why? Absolutely. I want her
Because
foot in
Luke Medius-
internal rotation.
Because Luke Medius is in her rotation.
Yes. That's the position we're starting in. We have her supine, towel under her foot on a large mat. I'm going to have her doing abduction exercises with her foot in internal rotation, because glute med and glute minimus are not only abductors of the hip, they're also hip internal rotators. So I'm maximizing the stability of my muscle. That's the position. If you try to make her keep her foot in neutral, she's going to turn it into external rotation. If you force her into internal rotation, you may keep it in neutral. Especially early on. She's a 2 minus. She's going to do all she can to try to complete the activity you're asking, and she's going to cheat. Okay? So, how do we back this down? Let's say she can't do that. How do we back this down? I don't want to pass it. I don't want to move it. She's weak. I'm strong. Mine moves. Wah! Super kick. Okay, I like that. Active assist. Gotta talk louder, sir. I can't. I have 2 ears, but I only can hear one sound. All right, active assist. Okay, so we start with active assist. If I'm actively assisting her, what am I doing? How am I doing it? Towel, okay.
Provide support.
Provide support. I want to do a little more than provide support. What am I doing?
I would probably do the first couple of degrees of motion and let her finish it.
Okay, I like that. So, or
Have her do as much as she can.
there's the go. So I'm supporting the foot. The towel works, but I want to be careful here, because if I put my hand under her heel and I give her too much support, so I got a towel in my hand and I give her too much support, now you're preaching. So this is me, this is my little old grandma. Now I have her in this position. Why is that dangerous? What position is she in now? Even more proximal joint than that. Hip, say it again. Hip flexion, yes. So my hand, her heel, this towel, too much. She's now in hip flexion. The hip is going to be flexed here a little bit. Knee will be in extension, but the hip will be in flexion. So what happens if I put the hip in flexion and I move into abduction? What am I working? Yes! Thank you. Your brain is on. I smell brain working. So if her hip is flexed and I move her active assistively into abduction, I'm moving her TFL. Is her glute working at all? No, TFL is doing all the work. So I need to be careful putting her in a position. I still need her flat. I still need the heel flat. So if I'm doing this, I don't want to lift the foot. I want to turn it into internal rotation, grab on the medial malleolus, and help her slide. See the difference? Don't do this. This puts the hip into flexion. You just wasted your time. I want the hip still in extension. Internally rotate. I'm going to internally rotate the foot. I'm moving her into abduction to assist her, active assist. Yes, that's what we're thinking. Okay, very good. Where do we progress? So we start active assistive. Now she can tolerate that. She can stimulate the muscle. She knows where she's going. Now we do supine because it's gravity eliminated with the towel under the foot. Sliding, she's able to do that, maintaining internal rotation. What would you do next?
Or active.
Would I want to go against gravity, or would I want to do something else?
Maybe start with bands first or upright.
That's what I want to do. I want to add resistance. Max out one plane before you move into a new one. So I want to add resistance to this gravity eliminated plane first. All right. Now, once my grandma's able to do that, she can move against resistance with TheraBand. Now her strength is increasing. Now she comes back week 2. I manual muscle test her. She is a 3 out of 5. Now what do I want to start doing? Sideline. There you go. That's the way you think about progression. When I'm looking at a person, start with the basic level of where they are. If they have no functional movement at all, and I need to move it, I need to start thinking about passive range of motion. Once they can start to add something to it, I go to active assist, range of motion. And I try to do it in the gravity eliminated plane. Then I go to active range of motion, gravity eliminated, resistance in that same plane. Then I go to gravity eliminated, range of motion. Then I start to add resistance with gravity eliminated. Isometrics, then isotonics, eccentric, and then isotonic, concentric. That's the progression. That's the way you want to think about your progression. Every time you're looking at a patient, what can they do independently? If they can't do anything independently, then I need to start where they're able to work and progress them through this. When you can isotonically, concentrically strengthen a muscle, then it should be strong enough to function in gravity eliminated. So, what's even less resistance than passive range of motion?
Isokinetic? Like the,
Isokinetic could be one, where it moves it for you. What's even more passive than that?
Muscle side?
Nah. So that's isometrics.
Thought it.
Now you see where all of that fits in. Now you see how you progress a patient through a strengthening program. If passive range even hurts and they can't function, we'll put them in a pool. Start there. Because pools do what? If I'm in the water and I'm at least if I'm waist high in the water, how much has that decreased my body weight? 50%. Waist high. If I'm chest high, 75%. Neck, 90%. So if I can get them in the water, I've decreased their body weight, which increases their functional mobility. That's the way you think about it. Does that make sense? That's there. Now, your skill, the skill of this, is to figure out 1,000 ways to do each one of those. That's when you're skilled. When I know 1,000 ways to work a person in aquatics, I know 1,000 ways to work them passive range of motion. I know 1,000 ways to work them in active assist, active range, concentric, eccentrics. You develop your skill set in learning that mechanism. But it starts from where they are. So let's say you don't want to manual muscle test it, but you can goniometry. What do we know about goniometry that gives us a manual muscle test?
They can complete the range of motion. Is it at least
so 2 plus? 3? Yeah.
If I can move through the full range of motion, I am at least a 3 out of 5. So if I can't get through full range of motion, my manual muscle test is partially done for me already. Full range of motion in gravity eliminated position is a 3 out of 5. Go to lunch. God, I love this stuff.